Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And it is a holiday season here in Trinidad, my native Caribbean island of Trinidad, and the news is I'm back home after more than 1 year of travel. We thank Allah who kept me safe during these travels and who brought me back home safely. It's a holiday season here, the Christmas, New Year's holiday. And while others may be celebrating, we are actually located in a perilous moment in our history in this country. And we are on the doorstep of war. United States waging war on Venezuela. That can happen anytime. And what are the implications, not only for Venezuela, not only for the region, not only for the United States, but most of all, what are the implications for Trinidad and Tobago of this most dangerous moment in our history? And we are very fortunate to have in my dear friend and brother, David Abdullah, a political analyst who has consistently maintained integrity in his analysis, to be with us here today to share with us his views on the implications of this confrontation, the United States confronting Venezuela, political implications, economic implications, monetary implications for the Trinidad and Tobago dollar, and of course, most of all, military implications. The United States began this drama by declaring that they are pursuing drug trafficking. And then they started blowing up boats in the Caribbean Sea. But they always consistently said, we're going to also attack land attacks. But our target is the drug trafficking. But now we see a maritime blockade around Venezuela, preventing oil shipments and the seizure of oil tankers. We want to begin by drawing attention to the viewing audience of this background to the confrontation now taking place. The United States has accused not only Venezuelans, but the government of Venezuela of being involved in drug trafficking. The United States also rejects the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government and put a ransom on his head. I think it's $50 million now. And finally, I don't know how the world is responding to it, but Trump now says that Venezuelan oil belongs to the United States. Maybe he should see a medical attention for his mental faculty there. What are your initial thoughts on this confrontation?
Yes, Malana, thank you very much for tracing that bit of that background. So about the middle of August, the United States sent several destroyers, about 6 or 7 destroyers with guided missile capability, a nuclear submarine, several amphibious landing craft, and about 5,000 Marines to the Southern Caribbean. So this was a major military intervention in the Southern Caribbean. And as soon as we saw that, we said, this is going to be about regime change in Venezuela. It's something that Trump in his first presidency had wanted to achieve, but didn't. And then, in fact, going back to President Obama started the sanctions against Venezuela that were intensified by Trump 1.0, and then Biden also intensified them. And you mentioned the bounty, quote unquote, on President Maduro's head. President Biden put a $25 million US bounty on President Maduro's head, and Trump 2.0 doubled that to $50 million US. So when we saw that flotilla coming into the Southern Caribbean, we knew that that was really about regime change. The U.S. talked about narco trafficking. But lo and behold, just before that, sometime in June or July, the United Nations Commission on Organized Crime published their findings, so it's a 2025 report, which said that the cocaine, which is largely produced in Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and so on, but largely in Colombia, that 85% of that cocaine goes to the United States via the Pacific coast, Colombia's Pacific coast, or through Ecuador and up the Pacific to the United States. Another 8% goes via the Western Caribbean through Central America then. And then about 5% is actually trafficked through Venezuela. But the Venezuelan authorities normally get, this is the UN data, normally get about half of it. So about 2.5% escapes Colombia through Venezuela and doesn't necessarily go to the US, a lot of that goes to Europe. That data was confirmed by a report by the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States itself, which also said that most of the cocaine does not come this way, does not go through Venezuela. Venezuela has no processing facilities, does not grow cocaine or coke the coca plant, and doesn't process it either. Mr. Trump talked about fentanyl because that is a major narcotic that is affecting Americans today when they consume it. But fentanyl is not produced in South America. A lot of it is produced in Mexico and then transits across the border from Mexico into the United States. So the whole narrative about narco trafficking was very much, and we said that from, I made my first statement, I think, was on the 21st of August, right after this military buildup. And I gave a very detailed statement. And I said, narco trafficking narrative is similar to what Colin Powell and Bush used, weapons of mass destruction, as the rationale to invade Iraq and to kill Saddam Hussein and create, well, mayhem afterwards, of course, in Iraq. So it was very clear to us that there's this false narrative that was being pushed, and that the real agenda was, as you mentioned, the resources of Venezuela, because Venezuela sits upon the largest reserves of oil in the world. And in 2013, 2023, Trump, having, was not in office anymore, but made the statement that had he stayed, Maduro's government would have collapsed. He actually said that. We were very close to having the government collapse, and then we would have had all the oil. So let me just quote the exact thing. So in 2023, quote Trump, "When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil."
Okay. This is Trump speaking.
That is Trump speaking in 2023.
We would have gotten all that oil.
We would have gotten all that oil. So one thing about Trump is that he says what is in his mind. A lot of the other U.S. presidents try to hide it and deflect, but he often comes out very openly and says it up front. We would have gotten all that oil. So he had that agenda for Venezuela's wealth, Venezuela's oil, which he recently repeated, as you have said, that Venezuela's oil belongs to the U.S., or all that oil belongs to the U.S. But I think there's another objective, which is not Trump's. Trump is very much about resources and controlling the minerals. If you remember, he offered Ukraine a deal in the war with Russia.
Rare
earth, precisely. Recently, for the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, a so-called peace deal, which is not really a peace deal, but again, DRC, which is very resource rich in gold and diamonds and rare earth, U.S. must get that. So he's always about those resources that other countries have that he wants for the United States and for his buddies, his billionaire buddies. The other person, though, that's driving an agenda in Venezuela is Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and also National Security Advisor. So he wears two hats, very, very powerful person in the Trump administration. Marco Rubio comes from Miami, parents from Cuba. So he comes from the Cuban-American community in Miami, which has been historically extremely hostile, violently so, to the Cuban Revolution. Marco Rubio wants to end the Cuban Revolution. And one way he thinks of doing that is to end the process in Venezuela. And that, therefore, will remove a certain support in terms of a major country for Cuba. One of the oil tankers that was seized a few days ago
was on its way to Cuba.
Was on its way to Cuba. And Cuba is going through great difficulty right now with the blockade and the designation of Cuba as a country that is sponsor of terrorism, a state sponsor of terrorism, which is not. How we got on that so-called list is because Cuba was facilitating the peace negotiations between some of the armed groups, the FARC in particular, and the Colombian government. And they actually brokered a peace deal. But those negotiations were taking place in Havana, where it was safe for everybody to be. And because FARC representatives were in Havana, the Americans say, well, the Cubans are supporting state sponsors of terrorism, which was the opposite of what Cuba was doing. They were trying to end armed conflict in Colombia. So Cuba is hurting, and they've been hit by hurricanes, as we know. And so, starving them of oil coming out of Venezuela puts more pressure on the Cubans. And that's Marco Rubio's agenda. But it's not a good situation for us at all. And eventually, a couple of us made a statement the other day, and one of the taglines was, "What is in the dark must come to light." And so it was about narco trafficking. That's what they claimed. We said no. It's about regime change and getting the oil. Mr. Trump now has not talking about narco trafficking anymore. He's saying, we want all that oil. And if I could give another quote by Trump, he said just about a week ago, all of the oil, land, and other assets that they previously stole from us. Previously stole from us, yes? And then Stephen Miller, who's a key person in the Trump administration, he is the Homeland Security Advisor, but he's ideologically the person who authored Agenda 2025, which was this very racist, right-wing, white supremacist agenda for the United States. And Stephen Miller said just recently, he said, I'm quoting, "American sweat, ingenuity, and toil created the oil industry in Venezuela. Its tyrannical expropriation was the largest recorded theft of American wealth and property."
So that is why he said belongs to us.
That's right.
Okay.
I mean, the fact of the matter is, that people from the West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, and so on, went to work in the oil fields of Maracaibo. And there's still Trinidadians who have families in Venezuela. And of course, Venezuelans work in the oil industry as well. And yes, it was American oil companies that were there, but they were extracting the wealth from Venezuela, enriching the United States and enriching the elites within Venezuela. That benefited from that relationship.
Yes. While the poor in Venezuela remain permanently poor.
That's right.
David, since the secret is now out, a very badly kept secret, that the real objective of the American confrontation against Venezuela is regime change. We now back to the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States, by divine or decree, the United States has the right to maintain its control over the entire Western hemisphere by divine decree. And every government in the Central and South America, even Canada and the Caribbean, must submit to American dominance. This is the Monroe Doctrine. No extra hemispheric power is allowed to meddle in this part of the world without our consent. For the benefit of our viewing audience, this is the Monroe Doctrine, which is maybe 1800 and...
It's a little over 200 years, about 201, 202 years old.
years or more.
Yes.
But the Monroe Doctrine itself forms part of something else called Pax Americana. That we not only are divinely ordained to establish our dominance over the Western Hemisphere, we are divinely ordained to establish our dominance over the world.
That's right.
Is Pax Americana. I want to shift from Venezuela for just a moment, and then we come back.
Sure.
Because I would like to hear your views on Pax Americana as to whether or not Pax Americana is now in decline, whether the US dollar is now in decline, and whether Trump has given up Pax Americana and is now content to have a local Pax Americana only in his backyard. And this explains his policies towards Ukraine, and he's not prepared to allow the European Union to stand in the way of what he wants to achieve in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, very, very, very key question. What has happened is that we have seen the rise, particularly of China, of Russia to a certain extent, but particularly of China, as a major power in the world. Economic power, China's economy is not far behind that of the United States. Technologically, China is probably ahead of the United States. Some time ago, China launched its own open source AI chat box, which rivaled, the American versions and so on, which cost a lot of money. And in terms of things like solar power, electric vehicles, a whole range of technologies, China is actually well ahead of the United States. Militarily, China very quietly has built up its military to be very strong as well, because China has not had to spend money on fighting wars. The United States has spent a huge amount of money fighting wars or supporting countries like Israel in their war and genocide in the Middle East. So with that, we have then had the development of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and there are other countries now that have also joined the BRICS. And what we are seeing are the development of many economic trading blocs that are encouraging and facilitating South-South trade, where countries of the global South are more engaged with the other. China has the Belt and Road Initiative, major investments in this part of the world and in Africa and so on. So what in Africa, you had the development in the countries of the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, throwing out French colonialism.
I plan to visit Burkina Faso next year. Go
Fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that you're able to do these travels, Maulana. And they show out French colonialism. So you're seeing the development of what is popularly now called multipolarity.
Multipolarity.
A multipolar world. In other words, not a single pole of the United States around which everybody has to revolve or everybody has to genuflect. And so I do think that Biden, when he was president, was trying to restore Pax Americana. He made this statement after he became president: America is back. And when he said America is back, in my view, that meant that America was going to be once. He was trying to make it preeminent over everybody else, and therefore would determine what happened in Ukraine, in the Far East, and so on. And I think that Trump is, because he's more transactional, is, while he sees China as a threat, is certainly trying to say this hemisphere must not be influenced or controlled by anybody else besides the United States. And just a few weeks ago, the Trump administration published their national security strategy. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing because I've been very
I read
busy.
part of it. Yeah.
Right. And I'll just quote one part of it because it's relevant to what you're saying. It said, one objective is, quote, to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere.
In the Western Hemisphere.
We will deny non-hemispheric competitors, and I put in brackets China and Russia.
China and Russia. And Iran.
And Iran, yes, the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities, and this is even more critical, or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere.
Vital assets and resources.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say, he even says this is now the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
Already.
Yes, they're describing it as a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Right. And is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests.
So you are in agreement that we are seeing a decline or an irreversible decline of Pax Americana and a concentration of attention on the Monroe Doctrine for the Western Hemisphere.
Yes. And of course, they will use proxies in certain parts of the world where it's strategically important for them.
Right.
Israel,
Yes.
critical, and in relation to the oil and everything else in the Middle East.
Would you join Pakistan in that with Israel?
That's an interesting one. That's an interesting one. The irony is that, of course, India also has a relationship with Israel.
Yes.
You know,
Not so much
as
spectacularly presented to the world as Pakistan.
yes, and Pakistan proposing Trump to win, to get the Nobel
To
Peace
the
Prize.
eternal shame and disgrace of the world of Islam. Yes.
Yes. So yes, that's an interesting one. I hadn't given that much thought. But
Okay.
That is certainly of
I'm
significance.
pursuing this discussion because I want to get a view from you as to whether the concentration of attention now on the Monroe Doctrine and the new Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine and the receding of Pax Americana implies that we are almost certain to see war.
In the sense that yes, but they're going to pick and choose the war.
Mm-hmm.
So one against Venezuela, but they're not going to go to war with China or with Russia.
No. We're talking about the Western
Localized.
Hemisphere. I'm
Yes,
talking about
yes.
war
In
in
this
this part of
hemisphere.
the world. That we are almost certain that tomorrow there's going to be war with Venezuela. That's what I want to hear.
Yes, I think so, because Trump has backed himself into a corner. After the initial military assets which they put in the Southern Caribbean, they then put F-35 fighter jets in Puerto Rico, B-52 bombers in Puerto Rico, and then they brought in the world's largest battleship, USS Gerald Ford, which doesn't travel by itself. It travels with a flotilla of other destroyers and other assets. So there are probably about 15 or more thousand Marines in the Southern Caribbean now. So that kind of deployment, you can't just turn it around
You can't walk away from
and
it.
walk away from it
No.
with nothing in your hand.
Yeah. That's one way of looking at the subject. That America, instead of looking great again, will look small
Yes,
if you walk away from it.
that's right.
But our approach to the subject is the Monroe Doctrine being more dominant now than it was before because Pax Americana is receding.
Yes.
Okay?
No, the question would be, how would they want regime change because they want to get the resources of Venezuela. How is regime change going to be achieved? So there are like 2 or 3 military, if you wish, strategies that could achieve that. One would be a surgical drone strike or missile strike, which kills President Maduro and some of the other leaders of the government and of the party, and then perhaps street protests and people coming in. That's one option. But the military in Venezuela, I think, is still very loyal to President Maduro. A second option would be the blockade, which they're doing now, trying to create as much economic and social dislocation. Because in the last 2 or 3 years, Venezuela's economy has been growing faster than any other economy in Latin America.
Already?
Yes. They've recovered. One, oil production moved from 200,000 or 300,000 barrels up to about close to 1 million barrels a day, which is below where it was at their maximum, but it gives them a significant amount of revenue. But they've also become significantly self-reliant in terms of their food production. We've had some people going to Venezuela recently, several delegations, and they moved about and so on, and they're growing a lot of their own food. Inflation is very low, and so the food is plentiful. The government, of course, provides a lot of housing. Electricity is low. There's healthcare, education. So the quality of life of Venezuelans has actually significantly improved compared to, say, 5-6 years ago when things were very difficult, when the sanctions were biting and some of the economic policies were out of whack and you got hyperinflation and so on. So if they squeeze Venezuela with the blockade, they may hope that that could precipitate some kind of social unrest and bring about regime change. I don't think either of those things will happen because the irony of it, which of course Americans never factor in, is that the Venezuelans are highly patriotic and nationalistic because they fought for their independence. And so when a foreign power now tries to overthrow and intervene, instead of them saying, yes, let us overthrow the government, they actually are cohering around the government to repel a foreign intervention. And so the government has armed the militia, and there are old people, women and so on, who say, I want to sign up for the militia because I'm prepared to die for my country. So the third option would be an actual war, bombing, and then land troops and so on. But 15,000 Marines is not sufficient to engage in a land war in a country the size of Venezuela, and with Venezuela's military capability. When they went into Panama, I think they went in at about 30,000. Panama is much smaller and the Panamanian military was much weaker. So Trump now is in a bit of a bind. If he wants to go and actually have war, is he simply going to try to bomb the living daylights out of Venezuela? That will destabilize the entire Latin America.
That's what I'm coming to now. This is the political and economic implications of war. But let's first begin with the military implications. Russia entered into an agreement with Venezuela last year for the transfer to Venezuela of advanced Russian weaponry. Amongst the most famous, well-known of advanced Russian weaponry is the hypersonic missiles, not necessarily nuclear armed. Now then, what are the implications if Venezuela already possesses Russian hypersonic nuclear weapons? Number one, for American warships, because these are unstoppable missiles in the naval flotilla. Number two, and more importantly for us, the airport in Tobago, which has a US installed radar, military radar. And I don't know where the radar in Trinidad is located. Is it in Piaco?
It has, I'm
Nobody
not
knows.
aware that it has been
Nobody
installed
knows,
yet,
yeah.
but it is probably going to be installed soon.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Venezuela, I believe, time for a break. Okay. Let us hold on until after the break and we continue discussion. Yeah.